so early on in the infancy stages of having these devices and understanding the technologies and what they're doing. And, for me, I'm so glad that you kind of added that, that context of like 40, I'm 38. So, we're right around the same, age and growing up, we, like you said, the first introduction was like a magazine, what I mean? It wasn't this infinite supply. And I get people all the time, push back like, oh, porn's no big deal. It's been around since the beginning of time. You can look in, caves and whatnot. I was like, that's why it's very important. Anytime I go speak somewhere or I'm on a podcast or I'm on a talk, I'm like, I'm referencing internet streaming pornography. It's a different animal than the magazine or even the VHS. It's a completely different animal. And one of the things I always say, when I do get an opportunity to speak to parents or I have an audience of parents that are listening and their kids there, I always say there will come a time in your young child's life when their eyes see something that their brain is not yet developed to handle. So can you speak to, Chris, like the development of the brain and why it's important for parents, to understand the stages of development in a child's brain and why it's important to understand what some of these devices and technologies are doing to a developing brain of a kid, 11, 12, 13, even 18, because full brain development, 23 to 27 years old, depending on male and female. So can I speak to some of the dangers of a developing brain?
It is essential that parents and anybody who has young people around them, right? If you're an aunt or an uncle, single, married, it doesn't matter. We all have young people that probably exist in our sphere of influence in some way. And Frank, I would contend that unless we understand their brain's development, we will not fully understand why they make the choices that they do online, nor will we understand the risks that I'm referring to. You said something really important from a therapy sort of counseling background, and that is I have a man who sits on my advisory board, a really great family therapist, and he talks about what the internet often does is it introduces ideas ahead of schedule, right? So developmentally, we have brains that are developing, right, being shaped, and there are messages and things that exist in this world that we are almost intended to learn according to a certain schedule that more or less aligns when neurologically we are able to respond in a way that doesn't do us harm as a species to that thing that we're being exposed to, right? And I would contend that what the internet often does, because its primary purpose is to like feed us information so that we're engaged, is it way too often in young people exposes them to information ahead of schedule. They don't have the ability to process responsibly what they're seeing in the digital spaces that we drop them into. Why? Because the brain during adolescence goes through a massive rewiring process. It is actually not ever again as shapeable as it is during adolescence, because of that process that you referred to that sort of winds down in the 20s, that myelination where those neural pathways, think of it like drying concrete, right? Can you reshape and change that road's direction? Yes, but after the concrete is dried, it takes a lot of effort and machinery and time in order to reroute that dried concrete. And that's what's going on at, if you want to give it something tangible inside of the brain. The adolescence is this time of a lot of wet concrete being laid inside of the brain. Neural pathways that are being, billions of new ones that are being created. And then whatever you feed your precious brain during adolescence, for all of its complexity, Frank, whatever you feed your brain is what it learns to love. And the way that I just make this sort of a laugh but not laugh moment in my parent presentations is I'll say to everyone in the audience, I'll say, raise your hand if you have issues. And they all kind of go, what? And they all kind of raise their hand like, yeah, of course we have issues. And they're like, okay. And then I'll ask them, how many of you have ever seen the show Criminal Minds? And they're like, oh yeah, we've all seen this show. And then it starts to make sense because I say to them, how many times has a serial killer started their problem in their 20s? Like, what is the root of everything that goes wrong in the show Criminal Minds? It's how they were raised. In other words, our issues, think about your issues. Most of those issues are as a result of something that did or didn't happen to you between the ages of 6 and 16. Now, is it that every single person who has some trauma or abuse or some neglect that occurs in their life during those very formative years, do they, does that always mean that their trajectory is set? No. There are some that emerge out of that miraculously sometimes and can carve a different path, but it's not easy. There's a lot of baggage that goes along with that. So neurologically, it's such a shapeable time. And yet this is when we give them access to lowercase g, God-like technologies.